We've got Dr. Mark Carey-Smith talking about neuroscience, positive psychology and behavioural economics, which sounds like a really interesting combination of topics to cover for InfoSec. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you. So after lunch on the last day, my expectations were reasonably low. So I'm sure you're all here to hear me, not because there was nothing else on or because you're just hanging around until the prizes. I'll believe what I want to believe, basically. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Yingarribie people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the presentation today should provide you with some interesting information gleaned from the fields of behavioural economics, positive psychology and neuroscience. And that should help you be happier, more insightful and more productive people and information security professionals. Usually during presentations I'm happy to take questions, but I'm not sure how we're going to go for time today, so let's try and save them until the end, please. And if I say something really inspirational and you are dying to speak to the person next to you, please try and repress that and talk to them when I'm finished. Procrastination. I was going to start with procrastination, but I really don't feel like it now. We'll come back to it later. There's an unfortunate attitude among some information security professionals, and I'll just apologise right up front for lack of the use of the C word. I'm really struggling with that. I'm a bit old, as you can see, and I'm going to use the term information security professional or InfoSec, just translate to whatever makes more sense to you. So there's an unfortunate attitude among some information security professionals to blame users and ridicule them for their choices and behaviour rather than trying to understand why. Anyone seen this video? Yeah, I've seen it shared a lot, usually with accompanying ridiculing assumptions that the people in this are really disclosing true passwords. Worst password lists are very popular fodder, very popular for sites like LinkedIn and shared a lot. Who's seen this one? No? Oh, that's interesting. I love a good hacker in hoodie photo. This one is particularly good. Not just the hoodie, but the weird mask ensemble as well. So recently, the United Kingdom's National Cyber Security Centre and Troy Hunt collaborated in releasing a list of the 100,000 most commonly found passwords in breached credentials. I'm sure we'll see this graphic a lot in the next coming months. The National Cyber Security Centre has a lot of good resources, particularly on the topic of awareness raising and culture. They have a really good sense of humour as well. I really like the material they produce. Included in the blog post for the 100,000 password list is the quote, "Security works when people act as a community." Now the phrase the information security community is usually used in applying to people who work in the industry, but I think it would benefit us to also think of the people that we need to help protect information, usually referred to as users, as being part of a community as well. It takes a village is a phrase that's usually applied to raising children, but a village mindset where people have empathy and compassion and look after each other is important for any community to function effectively. I feel more of a village mindset in InfoSec would benefit all of us. Look, behaviour change can be challenging, we all know that. Some people more than others. Quote, "The endowment effect is observed when people feel endowed with a particular artefact, such that they are reluctant to exchange it for any substitute, even if the substitute is superior," unquote. This comes from a seminal paper by Kahneman et al. Back in 1991. There are some interesting quirks with the endowment effect. It appears to apply not just to physical objects, but to time and intellectual property, including points of view, and can be triggered before something is acquired, online auctions for example. The degree of endowment appears to be proportional to the effort required to obtain the artefact and is particularly associated with things we've built ourselves. Dan Arley and Mike Norton have described this as the IKEA effect. This paper, How I Create My Passwords, or this is the way I create my passwords, is a very interesting look at endowment and how it may have an impact upon change in behaviour. In this case, the change in behaviour is trying to encourage people to change how they create their passwords, the routines they use for password creation. It contains some interesting conceptual, theoretical and methodological points, and let's have a look at a few of those. So part of the background for that paper are the different factors that can contribute to change resistance in people, which include perceived threat level, self-hurting, which is a propensity for people to repeat past behaviours, possibly due to a need for consistency or to avoid cognitive dissonance. People generally like to consider themselves as being responsible for positive changes and positive outcomes rather than negative ones. To admit that an existing behaviour is suboptimal may include acknowledging past mistakes, and people will often avoid this. And then the last factor that can contribute to change resistance is information avoidance. And that's the idea that people avoid information if it would require them to change their beliefs, to take undesired actions, or be likely to elicit unpleasant emotions. Now, all of those things could be relevant when you think about the advice that information security people give to lay people. If what you're telling them they perceive as something which might hurt their brains or make them feel bad or give them bad news, then perhaps information avoidance is part of the reason that communication can be difficult sometimes. It's a complicated situation, password creation and endowment, and probably differs from person to person. The authors of this paper just focus on endowment as one possible contributing factor to behaviour. So Marcus and Roby introduced two theory types useful for understanding organisational change. These can also be applied to individual change, and they are variance and process theories. So a variance theory's focus is on the conditions that are necessary and sufficient for an outcome to occur. In this case, we're talking about change. A habit, in its classical definition, is an example of a variance theory. The same cue will always trigger the same behaviour. Neil et al. Make the point that, quote, habitual behaviours are the default behaviour when people are unable or unwilling to make effortful decisions about how to behave, unquote. When someone is asked to change a habit, they're not considering equal effort options. They're being asked to switch to a more cognitively effortful behaviour, at least in the short term. This is sometimes called switching cost. Humans are generally present-focused and are more likely to be influenced by present effort than future benefit. This reduces the likelihood of behaviour change happening. This is termed psychological distance in the temporal dimension in construal level theory. Incidentally, there are 4 dimensions in psychological distance, all relative to the self. It's an egocentric model. That's why it appeals to me, probably. So the 4 dimensions are temporal, takes place further into the future. Spatial, occurs in a more remote location. Social, happens to people less and less like oneself. And hypothetical, is less likely to occur. The greater psychological distance, the less concrete and more abstract a construct is. This is important when we are trying to communicate abstract concepts, such as when attempting to influence risk perception in non-information security professionals. This is particularly the case when the availability heuristic has an impact. The availability heuristic means that people, quote, assess the frequency of a class or the probability of an event by the ease with which instances or occurrences can be brought to mind. And that's from a seminal paper by Tversky and Tanneman back in 1974. In decision-making processes, more available data, that is, data which is more easily remembered, have more impact than hard-to-remember data. Adding to the complexity of human behavioural change is the fact that we are generally fairly poor at predicting how we will feel in the future. This is called affective forecasting. So let's talk about the letter K, specifically the relative frequency of words in the English language that have K as their third letter as compared with words that begin with the letter K. So hands up, who thinks there are more words in the English language that begin with the letter K? Hands up, who thinks there are more words that have K as their third letter? Hands up who can't be bothered to put their hand up because they don't like putting their hand up. Hands up who's figured out why I'm asking this question and are actually answering on that basis rather than their first impressions of what they really think. Oh, one person's honest, yeah, two, good. So if that was the case and you were just putting up your hand because you figured out why I was asking that question, that's a good example of demand bias, where participants form an interpretation of the experiment's purpose and change their behaviour to fit that impression. So there are actually about twice as many words in the English language that have K as their third letter. But generally speaking, when you ask people this question, they answer it honestly. And they usually say there's more words that begin with K because it's easily brought to mind. And that's a classic example of the availability heuristic. So back to Marcus and Roby and their theory types now. A process theory's focus is on the conditions under which outcomes can occur but are not guaranteed to. It is more about the changes in states or changes that can occur in leading to outcomes. Cause precedes effect and makes effect possible. More cause does not necessarily result in more effect. Effect may not occur even if cause is present, and effects are influenced by social phenomena, which can be discontinuous and emergent. Change readiness is a process theory. Norcross et al. Posit that people inhabit stages of change, and if they're asked to change when they're not ready to, they simply won't. Sometimes information security professionals are confused why people with awareness of best practice will not unflinchingly and enthusiastically adopt that practice, such as with strong password creation advice. The assumption appears to be rooted in a variance theory that knowledge as cause will always lead to strong passwords as effect. The same can be seen in the assumption that awareness of an information security policy invariably leads to compliance with it. In both cases, the knowledge is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to bring about change. Cognitive and cultural biases influence risk perception and security behaviour, which are more aligned to a process theory. It's a much more complicated situation. So endowment effect leads to the following consequences: overestimation of the usefulness of the artefact, overestimation of the value of the artefact, and change unwillingness, which is the main outcome. The password change behaviour study concluded that the endowment effect does appear to change resistance in password creation routines, and that studying endowment on other areas of information security behaviour would be worthwhile, such as backups, patching, and phishing detection. These are all behaviours where people develop their own habits and routines for how they perform them. It reiterates to me that humans are very complex things. Simple explanations for suboptimal user behaviour, like people are lazy or stupid, are a mistake. Who knows what this is? Yes, good literal answer. It is a garden.
A self-developed pathway based on user walking habits.
Yes, very good. This is an example of a desire line or a desire path, and they're the paths that people forge for themselves in order to reduce effort and increase efficiency. As information security professionals, we should keep these paths in mind whenever we ask people to change their behaviour, particularly when we are creating or enforcing policy or changing the environment by implementing new technology or systems. Non-compliance may be a completely rational and understandable behaviour when we consider all the factors involved. Creating and encouraging open communication between information security professionals and the rest of the organisations they work in is critical in understanding users' needs and frustrations and working together to make information security an empowering influence rather than a pain in the bum. Procrastination. Actually, I still don't feel like it. Let's come back to it later. So positive psychology is a subfield of psychology that came about in the late 1990s to change the focus of psychology. A definition from Christopher Peterson is, positive psychology is the scientific study of what makes life most worth living. Positive psychology focuses on the positive events and influences in people's lives, including positive experiences like happiness, joy, inspiration, and love, positive states and traits like gratitude, resilience and compassion, and positive institutions, that is, applying positive principles within organisations and institutions. Let's take a look at a couple of ideas and tools from positive psychology that I think can help us be more happier, more insightful and more productive. Appreciative inquiry is a positive psychology methodology that flips the commonly used approach of identifying and fixing problems, that is, a focus on deficits, to one of identifying and amplifying what is working well now or has previously worked well. It's an inherently positive and collaborative approach to organisational change. Quote, appreciative inquiry is based on a deceptively simple premise. Organisations grow in the direction of what they repeatedly ask questions about and focus their attention on. Unquote. Appreciative inquiry uses a 5-step process model. 1, definition, what you want to build more of. 2, discovery, identifying and appreciating the best of what is or was. 3, dream, imagining what could be. 4, design, determining what should be. And 5, delivery, creating what will be. So, appreciative inquiry is often used as a behavioural change methodology, but it can be applied to individuals or teams. It's quite flexible. So let's just think about, I'll ask you a series of questions, and I'd like you to think about each question in the context of your professional life. Just have a little reflection on each question as I ask it. When you feel engaged, energised and enjoying life, what's happening? If you could do what you've just thought about more consistently, what might be possible as you look ahead? How can you move from where you are right now to where you want to be? If there was one action you could take, where would you be willing to start? So for some people, this might be a little example of job crafting, where you think about where you want your job to be or where you'd like to go, and then think about what are the simple changes I can make to try and get to that point. That's obviously going to differ from person to person, but if you apply these sort of simple questions in all areas of your life, it might lead to some interesting insights. So, what appreciative inquiry is not. It's not about ignoring problems. Problems are acknowledged, but are reframed as opportunities. It's not about only focusing on the positives. I'm sure many of us have been in organisational change meetings where no one will admit the truth, and it's extremely frustrating. Appreciative inquiry is inherently collaborative and participative. As such, it may not suit all settings. Psychological safety is a necessary prerequisite to ensure that people feel able to tell their truth and feel heard. Treating people with respect and compassion doesn't mean you need to say yes to everything. Being transparent and open and providing context for decisions is important. If you're wrong about something, be prepared to be open about it and admit your mistakes. Appreciative inquiry can be a different way of looking at how to improve situations. And as I said before, it can be individual, team-based, organisational-based. So let's take another look at the outcomes of the endowment effect. They are overestimation of the usefulness of the artefact, overestimation of the value of the artefact, and change unwillingness. What if people were endowed with good beliefs, practices, and values, and were unwilling to change away from them? One way to engender this could be to engage the people that use the systems that we implement and the policies that we write, and then involve them through meaningful collaboration and co-design to activate that IKEA effect. This could result in those people being endowed with the outcomes of the collaboration, giving them a strong sense of ownership of the result, which should make everybody's lives easier. This idea comes from the excellent podcast by Bruce Hallis called Rethinking the Human Factor. There are many studies in the information security literature that focus on users self-reporting their perception of risk. The problem is, such measures are influenced by a number of biases that reduce the findings' validity. These biases include social desirability bias, subjectivity bias, common methods bias, and demand bias. Many emotions that are elemental to perceptions of risk, such as fear, uncertainty, and distrust, are at least partially experienced subconsciously, making them difficult to accurately measure and difficult for people to express honestly. Also, many studies into people's risk perceptions are based on intention to behave rather than actual behaviour. This is a problem because people often describe their concerns about information security if you ask them, but then later on don't take actions to protect themselves. This kind of wishful thinking is not limited to information security, of course. It happens in all areas of life, particularly around behaviours related to health, exercise, and saving money. We have great intentions, but we often don't follow through with them. An alternative to self-reporting is to use a method of direct neural measurement, such as electroencephalography, or EEG, to measure events triggered by specific stimuli or actions associated with risk-taking behaviour. Let's have a quick look at one such study entitled Using Measures of Risk Perception to Predict Information Security Behaviour, Insights from Electroencephalography by Vance and Anderson. Vance and Anderson used EEG to measure participants' responses to gains and losses while undertaking the Iowa gambling task, a widely used method in psychology and neuroscience to study decision-making and is useful for its behavioural predictive value. Poor performance on the Iowa gambling task, or IGT, is strongly correlated with real-world risky behaviour, such as substance abuse, compulsive gambling, and criminality. Strong associations have also been found between IGT performance and real-world sensation-seeking, disinhibition, reward responsiveness, fun-seeking, and impulsivity. So Vance and Anderson started with a survey, asking their participants a variety of questions to measure their general risk tendency and other specific questions about information security risk perception, including some measures looking at perceived threat severity and threat susceptibility, and some measures specifically looking at information security risk perception as a broad measure. Then they used IGT using EEG to measure neural activity. Then they had participants undertake an image classification task, which included simulated security warnings, and that was designed to measure actual decision-making behaviour under an information security risk condition. This was a test to measure security warning disregard. And finally, a post-test survey. So the image classification task involved participants visiting a series of websites and rapidly identifying and classifying images as either real or cartoon. The time taken and the accuracy were both factors, and that was to simulate real-world working pressures. Participants used their own laptops, and that was to simulate protecting their own data. The image classification task was a ruse. The actual test was to measure how participants would respond to the security warnings. At periodic intervals, participants were shown a security warning stating that the site they were attempting to visit appeared to contain malware and asking them if they wanted to proceed. If they said no, they were penalised for failing to classify that image and showing the next image, which simulated the productivity costs that can occur with information security controls. If they said yes, they were able to proceed and classify the image. The EEG measures taken during that Iowa gambling task turned out to be a very good predictor of this security warning disregard behaviour. Approximately halfway through the task, participants were shown a simulated security incident with a full-screen message saying that their computer had been hacked. The purpose of the incident was to measure how participants' risk perceptions differed between the pre-test survey and the post-test survey, which was conducted after the image classification task was completed. The researchers found that self-reported measures of risk perception before the incident were insignificant, but the self-reported risk perception measures taken after the incident were almost identical to the EEG measures. This supports previous research that many emotions, such as fear and uncertainty, are not processed consciously, making them difficult to measure through self-reporting. The security incident appeared to make information security risk salient in the participants' minds, causing conscious processing. Taking into account the small sample of 62 participants and other limitations, there are some takeaways in this study for us. Self-reported risk perception measures can be problematic as predictors of behaviour under normal conditions. But when a security incident is salient in people's minds, self-reported risk perceptions are much more likely to be accurate. That's not because the perceptions changed, but because the behaviour associated with the perceptions did. When the incident was salient, the participants' behaviour was aligned with their self-reported risk perceptions. Before the incident was salient, the behaviour did not match the perceptions. How long this effect lasts was not measured, and that's really interesting to me. Perhaps psychological priming could be used to change people's behaviour in an information security context. This is probably behind the commonly used method of using fear appeals to attempt behaviour change when information security professionals are communicating risk, particularly to non-information security professionals. Fear appeals are persuasive messages that use fear to try to change behaviour. Fear appeals can be counterproductive if they're not used carefully. Simply increasing fear in one's audience without also providing clear and actionable solutions can backfire and result in a sense of helplessness and apathy, information avoidance, that is not listening to the message because it makes the listener feel bad, and a lack of trust in the messenger if the threat fails to materialise. Now, as information security professionals, we really don't want any of those things to occur. A more reliable way to change behaviour when using threats is to carefully consider coping mechanisms. Response efficacy, which is, will this action work to address the threat? And self-efficacy, that is, can I make this action work, are really important. To maximise chances of success when communicating threats, we should be using fear appeals sparingly and think about the balance between fear and hope. Take into account social norms and organisational culture. Have clear, simple and step-by-step messages that seem achievable to the recipient of the message. Make it easy for people to do the right thing by having InfoSec as part of the process. And be consistent in messaging and behaviour, particularly by people in positions of authority or influence. People have a very strong sense of fairness, and when they observe the difference between espoused behaviour and enacted behaviour, particularly in leaders, that can really affect them and really affect an organisational culture. Okay, how are we going for time?
You've got 12 minutes.
All right, well, we've nearly run out of time, so I suppose I should talk about procrastination now. So what is procrastination? One definition is the voluntary delay of an intended action despite knowing that one will probably be worse off for the delay. This is not the same thing as delaying a task as a result of prioritisation. That's completely reasonable. Procrastination is a complex thing, and it's different for different people and at different times. But it can be summed up by this elegant flowchart. There's been a lot of research done in recent years on procrastination. A quote from Dr. Fuchsia Sirois: "People engage in this irrational cycle of chronic procrastination because of an inability to manage negative moods around a task." And then a quote from Dr. Tim Pikell: "Procrastination is an emotion regulation problem, not a time management problem." Procrastination is a what? What is this? It's a vicious cycle. Very good. I was so happy when I found this image. It's a coping strategy for the negative and challenging emotions associated with the task at hand, such as boredom, anxiety, insecurity, frustration, resentment, and self-doubt. It's easier in the short term to avoid these emotions and let one's future self deal with the task. Once the decision to procrastinate is made, there's a momentary feeling of relief, a little reward for that procrastinating behaviour. Afterwards, more negative feelings occur, and these are called procrastinatory cognitions, because rationally we know that procrastinating is not a good long-term strategy. Both the short-lived reward and the negative feelings about the behaviour and the procrastination and the task contribute to this vicious cycle. So, some strategies that may help break the procrastination cycle. Forgive yourself as part of self-compassion. Self-compassion can increase motivation, feelings of self-worth, optimism, curiosity, and personal initiative. Try using a focused form of appreciative inquiry. Think about how you've handled a similar task in the past and identify the positive aspects of the activity and the outcomes. When procrastination arises, be curious about it and examine how you are feeling and what you're thinking about. This may reveal a cause behind the procrastination for this particular task. And then consider the next action. Think, if I were to do this now, what would be the next step? This can help generate action without motivation being present. Don't wait to be in the mood to do that next step, just do it. The action can actually lead to motivation. So action triggers can be used to break procrastination by making that next action happen, or more generally just to instill good habits. The general idea is to make a specific mental plan to take the next action to achieve something. It's a way of preloading a decision in a way that avoids the problems with affective forecasting and competing distractions. Say, for example, you know you need to exercise more, but when you wake up in the morning and you know you should be doing that exercise, or at least starting it, you just don't feel like it. You say to yourself, well, I'll feel like it more tomorrow, it's just that today I don't really feel like it. Tomorrow, no problem. I'll be full of energy, ready to roll. This might work. You really may feel more like it tomorrow, but more commonly, we don't really have a good feel for how we're going to feel tomorrow, and that's the affective forecasting flaw. We think tomorrow will be great, but in actual fact, it's often the same as today. So to help yourself avoid this situation, you can create an action trigger. Before you go to bed, lay out the clothes that you're going to wear for your exercise and lay out your shoes so everything's ready to roll. Then your action trigger could be, when I get up tomorrow, I'll put on these clothes first and then I'll do some exercise. So that's preloading the decision. You've already made the decision. When you get up in the morning, you're going to put those clothes on. That's your next step, a relatively small and easy step to achieve. Many psychology studies have found links between gratitude and well-being, including increased motivation, sleep, connectedness with others, job satisfaction, and economic patience, which is the ability to forego short-term satisfaction for long-term economic benefits, basically saving money. Gratitude has also been found to reduce anxiety and depression in some people. Google Images has taught me that a common way to express gratitude is to stand outside with your arms outstretched like so. Instead of trying to convince you of the benefits of gratitude, instead I will provide you with some suggestions for how you may be able to increase gratitude in your professional and personal life, and ask that you give at least one of them a try for 4 weeks and see how it makes you feel. The general strategy is to approach situations looking for opportunities to identify and appreciate other people's efforts, support, and kindness. After a while, it becomes second nature and doesn't feel forced or contrived. Some tips. Say thank you in a specific and truthful way. It sounds simple, and it is. It can be verbal, via email, sending a card, whatever works for you. Set yourself a goal of doing it once a day. Count your blessings 2 or 3 times a week and write them down. Focus on little things, not necessarily big things. This may take the form of a gratitude journal, but it doesn't have to. Just do what works for you. Or you can use gratitude meditation, which simply means reflecting on the people and the things you feel grateful for. There are lots of podcasts and free resources on the internet. Personally, I like guided meditation because I find it much easier to focus on, but look, everybody's different. Okay, fun fact. This text here, it comes from an auto-generated paper that some academics created to check if a rubbish conference, renowned for its aggressive marketing and low standards, would accept a paper without actually reading it. So they wrote a script to basically trawl through a whole bunch of other academic papers and pull out phrases that seem to make sense if you just look at it from afar, but when you read it, it doesn't actually make any sense whatsoever. And the conference did accept the paper. Later on, this became a big story, and a number of mainstream media organisations picked it up, and the conference organisers said, look, and this was just an aberration. we were really, really, really busy, and we didn't have time to read everybody's papers, and we didn't want to disadvantage some people that submitted a paper just because we hadn't read it, so we accepted everybody's papers. Sounds nice, but not true. All right, thanks very much for your attention. This slide's got some suggested resources. Obviously, I'm a big podcast fan. I think we've probably got time for a few questions.
Well, the first thing I wanted to ask was, just remind me, what was the name of that model you were talking about early on in your presentation? The some sort of effect?
The endowment effect?
Endowment effect. There was a really good example of the endowment effect, I believe, in the presentation of the 2018-19 AusCERT cybersecurity survey results, where Mike Holm noted that AusCERT had seen a decrease in the number of ransomware attacks reported by their members, most likely, in my opinion, because of the increased media coverage and the community memory of that having happened in the last few years. Would that be the right interpretation of that?
That's probably more the availability heuristic, the fact that it was front of mind for people and that they knew...
I knew it was one of the two.
Yeah, that it was salient, so therefore it was much more likely to be perceived as a relevant threat. What they didn't actually cover was whether that was a change in threat behaviour, because I have heard in other areas ransomware attacks appear to be more targeted now rather than broad, so that could have also explained that same stat.
Correct, but it was interesting to try and see that correlation between effect and change, potentially at least.
Hi, I'm just wondering, there's a thing called the Gretchen Rubin Tendencies quiz that I did a little while ago, and I thought it was really valuable. Do you sort of rate that or have any thoughts on that?
I haven't actually done that quiz. I do like Gretchen Rubin's podcast, which is called Happier, and she's written a bunch of books too. I think you're a big fan, aren't you, Gary? Yeah. So I haven't actually done the quiz. How did you find it?
Yeah, really good. So I found out that I'm a rebel in that if somebody gives me a task, I don't want to do it. If I give myself a task, I don't want to do it. So actually getting stuff done can be a challenge at times. But it's more about realising, oh yeah, that's actually the way I act. I can have a strategy to get around that if I need to.
Yeah, so I think with the rebel thing, you need to reframe tasks in such a way that you're not doing what someone's asked you to do because they asked you to do it, but because you actually want to achieve it yourself for some other reason. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
it's more like, hypothetically, this is the person I want to be, therefore I should take steps, not I should really do the dishes. Yeah.
Yes, so that's a bit like the taking the next action in terms of those tips about procrastination. You try and fool yourself into thinking, look, I'm not going to do this, but if I were to do it, this is what I'd do. And then that can help lead you on to the next step.
I believe one of the other speakers earlier today had something along those lines, that the only reason people ever do anything, even in the workplace, is because they actually eventually agree with it and then go on and do with it, not necessarily because they were told to do it, even though that might have been the original instigation.
Could well be. I mean, look, we're deeply, deeply complicated beasts.
So how can we use this to get over the fact that our users all have awareness and knowledge but aren't applying it?
Well, I think, I don't know your particular situation, but I would challenge the assumption that people all have awareness. I think, and even if we have some superficial statistics like 98% of the organisation has done a mandatory online training course, it doesn't necessarily mean that 98% of the organisation have received the message in a way that's meaningful to them. So my feeling is that if we're going to try and measure anything like awareness and culture, we need to be considering all the different factors at play. So not just asking people, what do you think about information security? Because as we saw, self-reported measures can be very tricky for them to be accurate for a variety of reasons. But that we should be also thinking about people's attitudes and their behaviour, and then how can we measure that in an effective way? It's a complicated thing, but my takeaway, I guess, is to try and encourage people to think about, this is a complicated situation. So more awareness doesn't lead to better behaviour necessarily. But a lot of people have that view, at least if they're asked superficially, what do we need to do? Well, more awareness. But more awareness doesn't always result in better behaviour. Does that answer your question, or was that a bit of a cop-out? Well, that's a very good leading question. So yes, what I should have said, in addition to what I did say, was understanding people's emotional motivations is a really important factor as well. And Switch by Dan and Chip Heath, mentioned over here, the book, second line, has some really important, really interesting methodologies in trying to engage not just the rational parts of people's minds, but the emotional aspects of what we're trying to get them to achieve. So I strongly recommend reading that book. There you go, that's my answer, read that book.
And I believe somebody else commented during the conference that the best managers are the ones that actually take the effort to understand each of their staff members and their upline management and actually work towards their personal needs and desires and goals to motivate them and achieve it. Anyway, we're all out of time. Could everyone please thank Mark for such an informative and educational talk? It was wonderful. Thank you.